All right. We have just finished walking through the context, text, and aims for the original audience in the world of the text. And now we're going to begin to think about how does this relate to us in our world. And so as we think about that, we want to think about discontinuities, continuities, and then Christ. So, how does the passage relate to the story of redemption and to us today is the overarching question that we want to be asking here. We're going to spend about 3 videos thinking through this, but the first thing that we want to do is think about discontinuities and continuities. So, what I mean by that is we want to, what's the same and what's different between the original text and us today related to culture, God, people, redemption, and ethics. So a lot of these I'm gonna go through pretty quickly. In fact, in the next video, I'm gonna hold off and do ethics in the next video. But let's go through here and think about culture. And there are 3 examples. So are there differences and similarities between the culture in the text and my culture today? So again, we think of Luke 7, and I brought these over from our work that we did in the context section in the biblical world. And we thought we were thinking about historical cultural context. And so these are all just taken from there, the types of hospitality that they showed in that day. Now, hospitality is something that we do today in my culture, but it's the type of hospitality that's different. We don't wash one another's feet and kiss their feet and anoint with oil and those types of things. And so there's a different type of hospitality there in that culture that we have than we have today. Also, Pharisees. We don't have Pharisees. So who are they? We talked about that when we were talking about the context discussion or video. Anointing with oil, shame and honor, denarii, and prophets. Those are all things that I would say are differences, and there's similarities though I would say is in that we do show hospitality in general, so we understand the concept of hospitality. It's just the type of hospitality that's different. Indebtedness, we can understand that in our culture that there is such a thing as indebtedness, and that you're in the debt of somebody else, whether it's a bank or another person. Now, what we don't have in common was the denarii and the type of money that they used. And also the similarity of social norms, in that this woman was kind of breaking all social norms when she walked in, and we have other social norms as well. And there even may be a similarity that you just don't walk into, as someone who's not invited, come into a dinner situation and disrupt the party. And so there's some similarities there in culture as well. What about in Genesis 21? Well, again, there's not a whole lot there in terms of history or culture that I can even bring out. There's being a refugee. That's a difference. I don't understand that at all, though some people do understand that because they've been a refugee. But that's a difference between my culture and that of Genesis 21. Dependent upon finding wells for water. Again, I've never been in a situation where I am utterly dependent upon finding water from a well in order to survive. I get my water from a tap, or I can take a bottle of water with me as much as I need. And so those are differences than from my culture to theirs. Now, I can't think of really any similarities though. There's not a whole lot again in this passage in terms of culture. And so it's really hard to think through what are similarities in culture between the two. Then the other one is Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. And there's just not enough in this passage to reveal any cultural differences or similarities. But I would say in Ephesians 2, 11 through 22, that you saw a video about, there is a lot there in terms of Jew and Gentile reconciliation and this making of this one new man in the temple, so on and so forth. Those are things, even though that still is true, that's still not something that's on the cultural forefront of our mind today as it relates to, again, becoming this one body now between Jew and Gentile. So let's think through, though, as it relates to God. Now, I would say this, that because God never changes, all that the original author was teaching the original audience about God will be the same as to what he's teaching us today. And so, because God never changes, He's the same yesterday, today, and forever, we can say that what we learned about God, and what the author was teaching to his original audience about God, is going to be consistent for us today. So we don't necessarily need to come up with differences. All of the whole list would be similarities. What about people? Well, similarly, even though there are differences between us and the original characters in the story, I'm not, I'm not a slave woman. I'm not Ishmael. I'm not a woman who is a woman of the city. I'm not a Pharisee. Those types of things. Even though there's differences in the original characters, or I'm not the original recipients of the letter either. The most important thing here is this: why we were created, our fallen condition, and the essential nature of redemption stays the same. So again, there's not going to be a whole lot in terms of differences, but our whole list will be similarities in what we share in our brokenness, in our fallen condition, while we were created, and the essential nature of redemption. All that stays the same. Now, let's think about redemption. This is important for us to kind of focus on. So, how does the redemption that God provides in the passage similar or different today? So, I introduced this chart to you in the redemption. We're thinking about redemptive context in the biblical world. And again, you got these 8 chapters of God's story, all the way from the pattern of the kingdom in creation through the perfected kingdom in Revelation. We live right there in the proclaimed kingdom. So we haven't experienced the end of the story yet. That's still to come. And so we live in the proclaimed kingdom where we've been given the Spirit. The people of God are made up of this new humanity of Jews and Gentiles, reconciled by the blood of Christ, making up this new body or this new temple. And our task is to proclaim the good news. Thus, it's called the proclaimed kingdom. We've been given the Spirit that dwells within us. God indwells us, giving us the power to know Him, to love Him, and to proclaim Him. So that's where we live. So, but when I think of the story of Ishmael and Hagar in Genesis 21, they're way back over here in the story of the chapter of the Promised Kingdom, the story of the patriarchs. Okay, so they're in a vastly different chapter of God's story where the people of God are just kind of beginning to be formed, barely. I mean, you've got Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, okay? And the nature of God has not been fully disclosed at this point. And how we relate to God, or how people relate to God, is still fairly up in the air. There have been some sacrifices, and God would show up in different ways to Abraham. So all that is fairly foreign to us, and because it's in a very different chapter of God's story. So let's think about this then in terms of the differences in this story related to us. So it's a different chapter of God's story. God's people were only then beginning to be defined, as I mentioned, and God had not given His word as to who He was and how people relate to Him, and if He would provide. Would God continue to hear, even though His name was called Ishmael? Would God continue to be the God who hears? And so these were all up in the air. Similarities then, God began to show Himself as one who does hear, cares for, and gives life even to the outcast. So we don't know that for certain, but I mean, we begin to get glimpses of that. But is that going to be God's consistent character? And so, because it's in a vastly different chapter of God's story, there are some major differences redemptively between that story and us today. In the next story in Luke 7, it takes place right here, right before the cross. Okay, it's a chapter that's not too distant from our chapter of God's story, but it is a different chapter of God's story. Who are the people of God in the present kingdom? Is it Israelites? Is it just Jews? Is Jesus going to stay on earth? Is he going to provide his spirit? These are all questions that have not yet been answered in the ongoing progression of this story. And so, as we dig into this chapter in Luke 7, the differences are, even though it is very close to our chapter of God's story and takes place in the New Testament, we are still living in a different part of the grand story of redemption. We just have to acknowledge that we live in a different chapter of God's story than this chapter takes place in. God's Spirit had not been given yet to give worshipers a new heart and new affections. Okay, this woman experienced redemption, but she still hadn't even been given the Spirit. And the Spirit has not been given yet to worshipers to change their heart and to give them new affections. And how far would the invitation for forgiveness go? How far on the outside is too far? Is it just to in Galilee? Or is it going to even go further, the invitation for forgiveness? Well, similarities is we begin to see that forgiveness is available, but how? How is that going to be available? Is it that Jesus just can go around willy-nilly and just forgive people? Or does something have to be done in order for that forgiveness to be available? We see that there is deliberate movement by God toward the outcast and potentially away from the Jewish elite who seem to be rejecting him. So we do see that there is a movement toward the outcast. We just don't know how far yet. And so the next example, again, is in Ephesians, and it's right there in the same chapter of God's story in which we live. So there's not going to be the major differences. And so the difference and similarities here is because this takes place in the same chapter of God's story, there really is no difference between when this was written and us today in terms of redemption. No differences at all. Jesus is the one that provides redemption by his sacrifice. We, just like the Ephesian believers, are raised with Christ. We experience redemption through grace by faith. We were made for good works just like they were. There's no differences in terms of redemption. We were dead in our trespasses and sins too. So there's no differences in terms of redemptive storyline. Okay, so next video we're going to talk about ethics, and we're going to drill down on ethics just a little bit more and see the differences and similarities there.